To day 3 of the 2025 Overlook Film Festival. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here in the morning for our amazing conversation with Mr. Joe Hill that we are about to have here today. My name is Landon Zackheim. I am the co-founder and executive director of this here Overlook Film Fest. Oh, hey, before we do anything else, one more round of applause for all the volunteers. Everybody who works on this fest does so in their free time, and we do it because you love coming to this, so thank you so much. I want to give some extra thanks to a few of our sponsors, especially Westin New Orleans for being a new partner. This is our first year using this panel space, so we hope you like it. We've got plenty of panels in here today. If you like horror authors, you may enjoy Grady Hendrix performing his new piece in here at 3:30 today. He will also be part of a horror fiction panel, hey, also in here, tomorrow at noon. And we've got a number of other wonderful shows. In here at 5 p.m., I would like to give a special mention to the history of spook shows that we'll be doing, and that'll prepare you for our big event tomorrow at Britannia Uptown, the Phantom Follies with Zabrecki, followed by our presentation of William Castle's 13 Ghosts. And yes, that will be in Illusiono, so don't miss that. We hope you make that. And finally, I do want to also shout out that we have at this festival this year, our 2025 Master of Horror, Mr. Ernest Dickerson, will be at the Britannia Uptown tomorrow, 2:45 p.m. for a 30th anniversary screening of Tales from the Crypt, Demon Knight, and then a conversation with Fangoria's Angel Mellinson, so do not miss that. Thank you to SAG Indie for sponsoring these panels this year at the festival, and thank you, of course, to Shudder for bringing this event. Shout out to Shudder, if you please. And now, without further ado, please allow me to bring from Shudder's own, Mr. Sam Zimmerman to moderate our conversation with Mr. Joe Hill.
Oh, is it on? Yeah. Okay. Hey, how's everyone doing?
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is simply a conversation. We're going to talk to Joe about his life and his work and see where he takes us. Where I want to start is something I've been thinking a lot about. I've been coming to this festival for years. It's one of my favorites. I think everyone in this room loves horror. We love horror movies, we love horror fiction. But we all get something different out of it, and talking to colleagues and audience members and folks who see things, what they love, varies in really beautiful ways. So something I want to start with is, what do you want from horror? And I mean that both when writing it and when watching it.
Well, I mean, I want to be scared. You know? I feel like that's sort of a almost too obvious answer. But when I see a horror movie, at least once I want to go ah. So I guess I want a horror film or a horror novel to give me some characters to love who have interesting problems that will maybe make me think about my own problems a little bit. But I want to find some people to invest in, people I want to spend some time with, and then I just want a great director to put them through hell. And that's really sadistic and sick and weird, but I'm like, I just love you, now I want you to suffer. but that is the appeal. That is part of what draws us to horror films and horror novels is, to see people face overpowering existential problems.
Is it important to you that they overpower it?
That they win?
Yeah.
No.
Well, that's part of what I'm getting at is, I think some people find a lot of hope in horror or want that.
And I think there is.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think, when I talk about it, so when you think about it, the fact that we're all into horror is really fucking weird. Like, why would anyone want to watch something that's gonna make it hard to sleep and is going to give you nightmares when you do? That seems perverse. But I'm fairly persuaded. I've done some reading by a guy named Matthias Clausen, who talks about why we love horror, and he tackles it from the point of view of evolutionary psychology. And I'm fairly persuaded that a passion for horror is a strategy for dealing with life's stresses and problems and fears and our own limits. And I think it's interesting, this writer, Matthias Clausen, one of the things he did is he co-authored a paper that showed convincingly that horror fans dealt better with COVID lockdowns psychologically than people who didn't like horror. And I hear people murmuring. I mean, I think most of us were like, well, this isn't so bad. I thought it would be more like Captain Trips. I have time to sit home and watch Shudder. So, I think that we're drawn to horror fiction because life is a stressful, frightening, existential situation to find yourself in that ends in your own death. And that horror films give us a way to sort of play with that notion.
Yep.
In a kind of safe and even fun way. And explore difficult questions that normally people don't want to go through their life and think about. Yeah.
I'm curious how we're on the 20th anniversary of 20th Century Ghosts.
Yeah, I got old.
A major work. I'm curious how all of those thoughts, wherever they were when you wrote it, if they've changed or not, worked their way into Best New Horror specifically. Because I feel like that is a piece that's wrestling with quite a lot.
Yeah. So first of all, obviously to sort of address the elephant room, my dad's Steve King.
Yep.
Not a bad writer. He's written a few things. I've read some of the pieces, and I feel like if he keeps at it, he's got a real future in the genre.
It's nice for children to encourage their dads.
Yeah. So when I was in college, I knew, by the time I was in college, I knew I wanted to make a living as a writer. But I had this fear that if I wrote as Joseph King, I'd write bad stuff that would get published anyway, because an unscrupulous publisher would see a chance to make a quick buck and a famous last name.
Sure.
And I didn't want that because I believed that readers were smart. I believed that readers might buy your first book because you got a famous daddy, but if it sucks, they won't buy the second. And so I stopped being Joseph King and I was Joe Hill, and I was able to keep it a secret for a fair period of time, for a while. My secret to remaining anonymous was failure. As long as you're not selling stories, as long as I was not selling stories, there was very little chance that I'd be exposed. But the other thing is so I was writing as Joe Hill instead of Joseph King. But the other decision I made, that was a good decision. I made a bad decision though, which is that for a while I tried to write New Yorker stories, stories about divorce and infidelity and raising difficult children and midlife burnout. But
Did you see that as a rejection of sort of where you had come from in a way?
I felt like as Stephen King's son, I couldn't write scary fiction. That would look too much like grabbing at his coattails.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a tough one for me because I'm a guy, when my mom asked what I wanted to do for my 12th birthday, I said I wanted to have my friends over to watch Dawn of the Dead. And we did that. We all sat around and watched Dawn of the Dead. For me, I was seeing it like for the 15th time. I was just like, eating popcorn, just totally into it, and hardly noticed that my friends were trickling out of the room. Until finally I was halfway through the film and I looked over at Brian Hannon, and he looked back at me slicked with sweat, and his face was completely waxy. And he said, "I don't think we should be watching this." And he walked out of the room, and I thought, did I err? Did I maybe make a mistake? I thought it was fun. when I was a teenager, I had friends who were jocks who read every issue of Sports Illustrated. And I had friends who loved rock and read every issue of Rolling Stone magazine. And I read every issue of Fango, cover to cover. That was my Time magazine, you know? And so I loved horror films. All my favorite writers wrote horror fiction. I was a huge Stephen King fan. But aside from that, I loved Clive Barker, you know? I loved the splatterpunk writers, John Skipp, Craig Spector, David Shaw, you know? I was into all that. Ray Bradbury, you know, I looked up to and revered Ray Bradbury, and the scarier he was, the more I liked it. So my favorite was Something Wicked This Way Comes. So I was trying to write these New Yorker stories, but it was bullshit. I didn't like those kind of stories. That wasn't my thing. And then I had this moment of revelation. I realized Joseph King couldn't write horror stories, but Joe Hill was Joe Schmo. He could write whatever he wanted. No one knew anything about it. And it was just this incredible moment of liberation when I realized I could actually write the stuff that I loved and wouldn't be judged. And so I began to write stories of the weird and unnatural. I think the first one I wrote was a story called Pop Art, it's a story about an inflatable boy, and his best friend is a juvenile delinquent. And the inflatable boy, Arthur, he's made of plastic, he's filled with air, and it weighs 6 ounces, and if he sat on a sharpened pencil, it would kill him. I had such delight writing that story, and unsurprisingly, it sold to the third market I sent it to, which was not a thing that was happening with my New Yorker stories, which I think had technical polish, but no inner life. There was nothing inside them to excite anyone. They didn't excite editors, but they didn't excite me. Best New Horror is one of the few stories, so I've taken a long way to get around to answering your question. Best New Horror, which is the first story in 20th Century Ghost, is about an editor named Eddie Carroll, who has been editing an anthology called Best New Horror for 20 years. And he discovers a short, and he hates it. He's sick of it. He's sick of the horror films, sick of the horror stories. It's all kind of become the same crap to him. And then he reads one story that's so demented, it lights him back up again, by a writer he's never heard of, and who has a really troubling sort of history, and is way out in the sticks, and he begins to hear rumors about his brothers who are pretty unsettling, but he still has to have this story, has to have it. So he goes way out in the sticks to find this guy, to get him to sign a release and to pay him a few $100. And basically, he walks into a horror movie. He walks into Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the only thing is, and I don't think it's a huge spoiler, this is the greatest thrill of his life. Because he spent his whole life preparing for it. It's like finally he's getting his moment. And I think that's one of a few stories in there where I was trying to figure out what horror meant to me, why I cared about it, why I thought those stories are important, why I thought people should read them, and so it's a little bit meta in the sense of I open the story with a horror story, which is about horror stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you.
It was pretty good. It was one of my best stories. It's been all downhill since then. 20 years ago.
Well, you also in the story, you're writing the story of Eddie, but you're also telling the story of
Button Boy.
Button Boy.
Yeah, Button Boy. So Button Boy is, so you actually kind of, but not quite, get the story in the story that so excites him, which is about Button Boy, who is this kid who has smiley face buttons where his eyes belong, and is a killer with a friend who's a killer, and it's real sick.
Disgusting.
It's disgusting. It's real sick. It's very.
And I say that with a big smile.
The story that he falls in love with is very right to the edge of what's acceptable, sort of 70s chainsaw horror, that kind of thing, and that was kind of fun to do the story inside the story. But I very carefully did not give you the story. I give you a description of the story in the same way when Tenacious D did Tribute. So it's not the best song in the world. This is just a tribute to the best song in the world. I played it safe.
What's What's the most demented piece of horror fiction you love?
Oh, there's so much. There's so much. I mean, both Reanimator and Richard Matheson's Hell House are pretty fucked up when you look close at them. There's some really demented shit in those, in the movie and in the book. Actually, I've never seen. Have I? I don't think I've ever seen the film that was made out of Matheson. I don't think I've ever seen Legend of Hell House.
It's my favorite haunted house movie.
Really? It's that good?
It's great.
Has anyone else seen it? A few people. Was it really that good?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. All right, let's go right on the list. I think the only thing is I think maybe I did see it when I was a teenager, that I caught it on video, but I don't remember it all that well. So maybe I missed something. I don't know. I was ripped, but I love the book. Those first 3 books of Blood by Clive Barker, I don't think have ever been equaled, in the sense of just the complete shock of his willingness to go places no other writer was going. His imagination seemed to, be more macabre and twisted and to have a depth and reach that was staggering. He was kind of the Hieronymus Bosch of the page, of the written page, and so those books were really remarkable.
I think In the Hills, the Cities is like the example of that.
Absolutely. Just, but the other thing is like I got kind of a tender heart. So there's a lot of stuff that I haven't seen that I kind of like I've never watched Audition, because I was always like, ooh, she's got that needle. I've seen the needle, I don't want to know where she's going to stick the needle. I'm like, I'm timid.
Arguably, Audition has a bit of a tender heart.
Really? You think?
I think so.
Yeah.
The first half.
I think that people feel like I write horror, and I've had most of my adult life sort of professionally in the horror business, so it must be impossible to scare me. Actually, it's the exact opposite. I am a dude who's like, you don't want to sit next to me in the film, because I'm like, oh! And it's just the credits, it's just like the music, it's just although actually, but sometimes not always. The other thing is, I'm friends with a lot of writers who write horror fiction. And it can be interesting when a whole bunch of us go to a movie together. I remember going to see The Ring 2. And it was me and a few other writers. I was sitting next to Christopher Golden. And, but the theater was filled with teenagers, just packed with teenagers. And every time there was a jump scare, everyone around us would be going, ah! But us, the writers, would erupt into laughter. And it was like a really weird cognitive dissonance with like this one bunch of people laughing hysterically and everyone else screaming. But it was a good time. Every time there was such a level of appreciation for any good jump scare.
How do you look in total at 20th Century Ghosts now? I feel like when I was writing them, I was trying to figure out, what matters to me. And now I kind of know, so it's easier to sort of. I think it's easier for me when I talk about my characters or my stories. I have a tendency to say, I don't write autobiographically. The characters in my stories are always often very different from me, and the story is my chance to explore what they're like inside. So the first novel, Heart-Shaped Box, is about a heavy metal musician named Judas Coyne. And Judas had a 40-year career in rock and roll. He's had platinum albums, he's played stadiums and festivals, did MTV videos in the 80s for MTV, but now he's kind of on the downslope of his career. And he's holed up in his estate in upstate New York with his groupie girlfriend, and he just collects weird shit that he buys on the internet. And that guy isn't anything like I have almost no points of similarity with Jude. I didn't even really grunge wasn't even really my thing in the 90s. I was more into Britpop. I liked like Oasis and stuff. So he's a very different figure than me. But I loved writing about him because it was so interesting to try to figure out, like, why is this guy so angry? He's had it all. He's had an amazing life. Why is he so pissed off all the time? And I got a chance to figure it out over the course of the book. But 20th Century Ghosts is an exception because,
a lot of those stories are about young, unattached, isolated men who are, you know, young guys who are frustrated and, you know, don't know how to make their way in the world and can't even imagine a future in which, you know, they have a meaningful life. And I think that's true again and again and again, character after character in 20th Century Ghost. And that is a kind of write what you know thing. You know, I was in my 20s and early 30s, and that's what I knew was I couldn't really figure out how I was going to make my way in the world.
I'm curious.
So it was that was my in. That was what made it possible to write those stories. You have to have some kind of to write a story. You have to have some door into it, and that was my door into it. Those characters.
I'm curious how that relates to Alec in 20th Century Ghost, to someone who's kind of given his life to this theater.
Oh,
And is perhaps that's the only thing he was attached to?
so 20th Century Ghost is the second story in the book, and gives the book its title, and is about a small town movie theater, and you know, and there's a girl who loved the movies so much that when she died, she kept going to them. So occasionally, Imogene Gilchrist turns up, sitting in the theater to watch a movie, usually on opening night. And she usually appears to someone who also has a special relationship with movies. But you know, if you look at that story, you know, the heart of the story takes place, I want to say, in about 1944. And Alec has just learned he's lost his older brother, a kind of idealized Jimmy Stewart type figure in the Pacific, that his brother is gone. And Alec himself is too young to serve. And he doesn't know, because the 40s were a different time, he doesn't know that he's been traumatized, that the loss of his brother has. He understands the grief, but he doesn't really understand the things that he's working through. So instead of going to school one day, he bums around downtown, he breaks some windows at an empty factory, he does some shoplifting, and then he sneaks into the movies without buying a ticket, and he sits down and he watches something on the screen and has a kind of, it's Fantasia, and has a kind of a moment of catharsis in the dark, when he is able to finally begin to grapple with the loss of his brother, with the loss of young men in the Pacific. But he also meets Imogen there. And at first, she is the hottest girl he's ever been that close to. But he knows there's something wrong, because she wasn't sitting there when he sat down. And then he realizes he's talking to a girl who's dead. Alec, I never lost a brother in the Pacific, but in some ways, Alec was an easy character to write. And what was harder is the story has a framing device set almost in the modern day, when the theater is close to collapsing, and because the world has changed, and small town movie theaters, a lot of them haven't survived. And so it was a little bit harder to write about the older version of that guy, because I had still not lived enough to really, but I think I was able to fake my way through it.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those beautiful stories.
Oh, thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about Abraham's Boys.
Yeah.
So we have a film premiering here, Abraham's Boys, at 3:30 p.m. today. I hope you're all coming.
Wonderful picture directed by Dennis Gulliver and Brady Hepner. Spoiler alert, I thought it was awesome. It's a really, it's she Hitchcocked the hell out of it. It's a really suffocating work of suspense and very humane, and I love it. So I'm excited for people to see it.
Yeah, well, I would love to hit a few things. One, about the story itself, and
Yeah.
your conception of it, and wanting to dive into the world of Dracula, and
Yeah.
your perspective on the psychology of Abraham.
Let me just tell you, it's quite a trip to have written a story 20 years ago for $400 that is now a terrific motion picture. And that seems like quite a strange journey. So the story of Abraham's Boys is, I was a failed novelist. I wrote 4 novels that I was never able to sell. I spent 3 years on one called The Fear Tree. Actually became a huge international bestseller in my imagination. But in real life, it was turned down by every publisher in New York City, every publisher in London, and then for a final humiliating kick in the crotch, every publisher in Canada, which proves that no matter how low you fall, there's always further to go. So I had mostly given up on writing novels. I had begun to suspect maybe I didn't have a novel in me, that I took my best swing and that particular skill had missed me. But I knew how to write a short story, and I had started to have success with my short stories. I had started to sell stories. Some of them got in best of collections or got award nominations, won awards, and I felt like, okay, I know how to do a short story. An editor named Gene Cavalos put out a call, an open call, which I will have seen in the back of a magazine, and I wish I could remember which one. I mean, for all I know, it might have been in the back of Fangoria magazine. But she put out a call. She was drawing together an anthology of stories about Van Helsing. And I thought, I'm getting that fucking collection. I mean, I'm just like, that's happening. And so I spent about 2 days, kind of like going on walks, thinking like, how do I write about Van Helsing? The first thing I knew was I had to get him to America. Because if I said it in London, he was going to be like, there were going to be characters tooling around in the mist, going, cheerio, old fish. And, it was just going to suck. I was just not going to be able to do that. So I had to get him to America. And then I was like, what do I feel about this guy? How would I think about him? I thought it would be interesting to think about, like, what would it be like to be Abraham Van Helsing's son? It's not hard, if you think about it, to imagine why I would come at it from that. And so I was thinking, well, what if your dad was the great vampire killer? Would you look up to him? What would he be like? But then I started to think, what if he's not actually that good a guy? I mean, he's got this obsession with, staking young women through the heart. They're evil, we hope. But what if they're not? And so I started to toy with this idea. I don't want to go any further than that, but I started to toy with this idea that maybe Van Helsing had secrets and was more complicated than we initially knew. And that became the story, and Gene Cavalos accepted it, and it wound up in the book. And I think of all the stories in 20th Century Ghosts, that was the one that I actually got the most money for, aside from a story called Better Than Home, which won a prize and got a bunch of cash. So the Black Phone, which was later made, which is in that collection, was later made into a film I got paid $35 for. And I'm not sure I ever got the check. I was promised $35. That doesn't mean I got it.
You just mentioned the Black Phone. Abraham's Boys is premiering today. Your work has been consistently adapted. Feature films, television series.
I've been very lucky, and part of that luck has involved with some of that luck has involved with writing high concept fiction at a moment when there are 10,000 streaming channels. So I happened to find myself in a period when there was just a demand for so much content that many more things are getting adapted than ever before, which has been kind of amazing. And the other thing is through the ups and downs, horror itself as a genre is kind of recession-proof. It's one of these things. Horror fiction is kind of like cigarettes and Campbell soup. People are going to want it always, but especially when times are bad, they seem to stock up on it. They're like, I got to fill the cupboard with sirloin burger, Campbell soup, and Stephen King novels. And so I've been lucky. So I think I've been lucky, but some of it has to do with just happening to write the right kind of particularly commercial stuff at a time when lots of stuff is getting adapted.
When a process starts on an adaptation, I mean, what do you look for in that process, both in wanting to be near it or far from it?
Yeah. I mean, I think you know. So I've actually been very lucky, not just in that I've had a lot of stuff adapted, but that the quality has generally been pretty high. I mean, Abraham's Boys is a wonderful film, and The Black Phone is a wonderful film. But I've had a bunch of other stuff. Shudder did a series out of Creepshow, spinning off of the original movie. Several of my stories were adapted for Creepshow. I think that one of them, Twittering from the Circus of the Dead, which was done as an animated 20-minute short for Shudder, is actually right there on the list of the very best adaptations I've ever had. It just looks so great. It is purely the story. It has the actress Joey King was cast to do the narration. There's Greg Nicotero, who produced. That's definitely an in-joke that he cast Joey King to do the voice. But she was terrific. She really delivered, and it looks awesome. The art, there are zombie clowns in it. That's actually based on the zombie clown creations of Eric Powell, who draws The Goon, and was a Southern comic book artist from this area, although I don't think he lives here anymore. If you haven't read The Goon,
It's great.
it's awesome. It's just the absolute best. But how do I prepare for an adaptation? I mean, I'm always glad to read a script and give feedback and give my best advice and be involved somewhat if that's helpful, but also to get out of the way if that's not. I'm not terribly possessive. My view of someone adapting a book or a short story or a comic book is, I already took my swing at that story. I did my version, you know, and you know, if a director comes in or a writer comes in and wants to do something of their own, they should intend to do something of their own. And my role is essentially to support that to the greatest degree that I can, but also to try to head off bad ideas, you know, because sometimes you'll be like in a writer's room and, you know, for a show maybe, and someone will say, you know, how about this? And, maybe it's my job to say, how about not? Because sometimes someone will be trying out an idea that I actually already tried out 3 years ago in an early draft and it didn't work. So I already know it's not worth bothering on because I already explored that idea and it won't work out like they're hoping.
Yeah.
You know, but so that's basically it. Support as much as I can. I've also been an executive producer on a lot of stuff, and let me tell you, I am great at being an executive producer. I have mastered the fine art, because a lot of people don't know what executive producers do. I know. So my job as an executive producer is to visit the set, eat everything on the craft surface, wait until the actors are performing the most emotional scene in the film, and then walk through the background laughing on my phone, and totally ruin the vibe. And then usually take an exhausted director out to dinner when they would rather go home to bed and just like conserve some energy, but instead I force them to be social with me. So if you can do all that, you too can be an executive.
You mentioned, you know, some of your work's been adapted into the Creepshow series. One of those stories was Mums, which is a story I'm very interested in.
Yeah, that's in Full Throttle. That's
yes.
Right, which was the last one.
And I would just love to know some of your thoughts on Mums, especially how it relates to perhaps some of the social and political climate we're in now.
Yeah, Mums is a weird one. Mums is about a kid who lives on essentially a survivalist compound, a sort of, you know, fringy, far right, you know, he lives among people who believe, you know, that money is fake, that, you know, the gold, essentially, that the moment the dollar stopped being tied to the gold standard, it became fake, that money isn't real, and that the IRS is, you know, is there to, you know, strip away the liberties of, you know, white guys, basically, and they're very Timothy McVeigh types. Yeah. And the kid and his mom, the mom tries to get them out of the compound, and they're brought back, and then mom disappears. And later in the story, she reappears in a pretty chilling way. You know, that was a kind of harder story to write, and I love the adaptation of it that appeared in Creepshow. You know, it's trying to do a lot of different things. It's trying to, you know, write about, you know, Timothy McVeigh types. It's also trying to be an effective story of the supernatural. You know, I do think that it's interesting, you know, as I've gone on, I've become more and more interested in trying to write about people who don't share my views, and to see to what degree I can write about them fairly and honestly, and possibly even, you know, make the reader who probably doesn't share those points of views briefly unsure about whether they dislike them or how they feel about them, and you know, to see if I can't, you know, disturb our sense of, you know, what we think we know about other people. Certainly, my next novel is titled King Sorrow. It's the first book in almost 10 years. It's a big one. It is 10 gazillion pages. But if I did my job right, I mean, the thing about a long book is, if I did my job right, it won't feel long. You know, you'll blast right through it, and when it's done, you kind of wish there was almost like another chapter. That's the goal. And I think especially in a really long book, it's gotta fucking move. You know, I mean, if it's 150 pages, you can be meditative, you can be contemplative, because the reader is like looking ahead and going like, well, there's not that much left, it's okay, I'll keep going. But if you're really like interior and quiet, there's not much going on, and you know, and you're like sort of trudging through the pages, you know, it's beautiful writing, but you're like, not much is happening. You get to page 100, and you're like, oh my God, there's 800 pages. You know, and then you're, you know, gonna put the book down and probably put on Shutter or something. I don't know that. Oh my God. You know, but so one of the things in King Sorrow is there is a character. There are 6 friends who we meet in 1989 in college, and one of the things I did, and the book's not terribly political, but one of the things I did is I tried to make each character a different point on the political spectrum. So you have a twin brother and a twin sister, and he is like a Willie Nelson, you know, legalized pot, far left hippie, and she is far right, you know, hardcore, head of the college, you know, conservative club. Conservative, you know, and they're always at odds with each other. And then in between them, I have like sort of a libertarian tech bro. I have a kind of middle of the road kind of Christian conservative, not actually real far right, but definitely not to the left. Then I have kind of a middle of the road kind of, you know, liberal but not very far left. You know, and then there's another character who's almost completely just interested in local politics, isn't really a political creature at all. And I kind of tried to cover the whole, but the important thing was, I wanted you to love all of them, even people whose views don't match your own. And sometimes that's tough, and every character fucks it up sooner or later. Every character in the story makes mistakes, because that's how life works. They all do something stupid sooner or later. And they keep trying to do right, even the people who don't agree with you. And that's kind of interesting, and hopefully takes the reader on a fun trip, on a fun exploration. We'll see.
I think, you know, going all the way back to where we started, one of those powers of horror is to make you feel compassion for someone going through something.
True. Although also sometimes we vicariously enjoy seeing a shitheel eaten by a werewolf.
I would say more than something.
I mean, I think that's also one of the pleasures. I mean, one of the pleasures of all fiction is when you meet someone who's very different from you, and you discover that actually they have a soul too, that they are also someone you could care about. That's fun, and it's also great when you read fiction and you meet a character who you love, and then they start fucking it up. And you're like, no, stop. You don't want to be with her. You want to be with her. You're supposed to, what are you doing? You know, and that can be fun too. But for sure, horror fiction is really good at you know, at giving us that kind of nasty, vicarious pleasure of, you know, seeing someone devoured by the zombie.
Oh, yeah.
Boy, were they asking for it.
We're going to go to the audience in a minute,
Yeah.
but I do want to consider the fact that, you know, 20th Century Ghost was an early book for you. Looking back at it now, where you are, are there new authors you're invigorated by? Like, who's now releasing their first things that you're excited by?
I read a book, it's not out yet, it's called When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. I don't know if any of you have tried Nat Cassidy, but you're gonna wanna try this one.
Nestlings.
So the only one of mine the only one of his I've read is When the Wolf Comes Home. I actually think Nat Cassidy has to be stopped. We have to do something about this guy, because not only is that a great book, I mean the pages just fly, apparently he's a really good actor too, and also does improv, so fuck that guy, we gotta work there. He's really good. If you like folk horror or historical horror, there's a guy named Christopher Buehlman who wrote a book called Between Two Fires. Now he's not, you asked young writers who's starting out, he's been around the block a few times, okay? He's an old pro, but I feel like he's sort of being rediscovered now. So he's a lot of fun. I mean, there's been a lot of great, I loved Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. I thought that was great. And what was great about Hidden Pictures is that's about a little kid who sees dead people, a favorite subject in horror stories. And he's drawing pictures of them, and he keeps drawing stuff like, and the pictures are in the book. So you get like his picture of an adorable, funny bunny, you know, big bunny, and there's like an air balloon, and then there's Mummy with her eyes scratched out standing in the background. And it's like the pictures are like, ah! I've never seen a visual scare in a book before until I read Hidden Pictures. So
That's cool.
But it's been a really, really great time for horror. There's just been one, and I'm talking more about books and films. Tanana Reeve Dew,
Yep.
who wrote The Reformatory. I mean, The Reformatory is not just one of the 2 or 3 best horror novels of the last 25 years. It probably belongs on a top 100 list of the best novels, period, of the last 25 years. That was incredible. A woman named Alison Rumfitt wrote a book called Tell Me I'm Worthless. That was like
A devastator.
oh my god, it's so nasty too. Boy, bewilderingly nasty. But it's also like a PhD thesis on the English haunted house story. And it's in conversation with great books like The Haunting of Hill House and The Woman in Black, and Alison Rumfitt is like the student who wildly overstudied for the exam. But that's a great one. There's just tons of great stuff out there right now.
That's great. Audience questions. Is everyone
Yeah.
ready? Okay. How are we doing this?
Our mic's not working.
Okay.
So project.
Speak loudly.
Go ahead, you.
Right there.
So I really enjoyed what you were saying about adaptations, and here's sort of a question. Like at CinemaCon this week, they announced that they were doing The Black Phone 2.
Yeah.
And I don't know your involvement in that adaptation, but what do you feel when something spins off from one of your original stories?
And I've had that happen a couple times. I mean, in the sense of, the TV show Lock and Key went past the material in the comic book. So there was a 3rd season that sort of skates past everything we had in the comic into stuff that I had speculated about but not written. I had a short story in 20th Century Ghost called The Cape. That's about a guy who finds his childhood cape. When he was 8, he used to run around and pretend he could fly. And as a burned out 20-something, he finds that cape again, and it turns out he can fly. And it turns out that not all men who wear capes are heroes. And that was adapted as a standalone comic. And then it was by Zach Howard and the artist Zach Howard and the writer Jason Chiarmella. And it was so successful, people liked it so much that it was actually expanded out into a whole series that was a lot of fun. And has Eric, the guy in the cape, at one point drops a baby grizzly bear into the back of someone's car. And any story with a fallen grizzly bear, attacked by fallen grizzly bears, got to be good. So in terms of The Black Phone 2, all I can say about it is, I knew when I saw Ethan Hawke in The Mask that there was a chance that not only the film might be a hit, that it might be a series. Because when I saw that mask, I instantly thought Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees. That mask is iconic, and people are going to want to. It's going to visit people in their nightmares, and they're going to want to revisit it on the screen. And you know, the film did come out of the box, and it was pretty successful. We did start to talk about sequels, and I wrote an email to Scott Derrickson and C. Robert Cargill with a thought, sort of an idea, sort of a story. No, I guess it was more of a story. Where I said, because I spotted that there was a trap door in the first film that could be lifted up to open into a second story. They had left this one thing in the film that could be profitably explored to make a film that would feel like it mattered, that it wasn't just a chance to cash in on some more money. And they dug that. They're like, Scott's like, okay, I love that. and then we did essentially what happened with the first film. With the first film, you get the whole short story. The whole short story is right there on the screen, but that's only 30 minutes of the movie, which makes sense. It's only a 30-page story. You also get all this stuff about growing up in dirty North Denver in the 1970s. And it's like the 400 Blows, and it's very autobiographical, and that's all Scott Derrickson. And then The Black Phone, the first film, also has an escape room mechanic going on throughout it, and that's Cargill. And so we each brought one facet of the story to the film. And there's been something of the same thing in The Black Phone 2, where I feel like each one of us had this one piece that we could fit into place. Hopefully it works, and we're gonna have a chance to find out this October.
Right there?
Yes. I read 20th Century Ghost, and one of my favorite stories, you mentioned it, is I believe Pop with the lady that
Pop art,
befriends.
yeah.
Yeah. I like that story because it's so at left field, so different, and it's kind of one of your stories that actually has a happy ending. But I was curious.
I learned not to do that later.
Yeah.
Also, you got a weird idea of happy endings. Wait a minute.
Happy ending.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. But I was curious, was there any doubt that was like, man, nobody's gonna like this, nobody's gonna understand it, nobody's gonna, get it, and what made you fight through that doubt?
Well, one thing is that story. So I said that it sold to the third place I sent it, but actually, it was sold to a book of Jewish magic realism edited by Dan Jaff, who knew I wasn't Jewish but that was okay. He didn't mind because he wanted to show how the Jewish magical realist Isaac Bashevis Singer, Bernard Malamud, writers like that had influenced outside of Judaism. But Dan ran me hard. That story was rewritten again and again and again. I rewrote pop art more times than I've rewritten anything in my entire life, except for issue number 2 of Lock and Key. I probably did 17 drafts of pop art. So I felt pretty good about it by the time I was pretty confident that it was, because I just thought if there was, it's like the beginning of a horror film.
Just got an idea, didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah, I felt pretty good about that one. I mean, but also I had had so much experience with rejection. I had had so many stories turned down that I started to kind of trust the process. I was like, if it's sold, something must be working, because no one's just going to buy anything as a favor. They're gonna, if it worked because it impressed at least one person, and that's the guy paying for it. So yeah, I wasn't too worried.
Great. Yep.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to talk to you a little bit about world building. I noticed
Yeah.
that you have, for example, you have Nosferatu, you have Christmas Land,
Yeah.
and some of your other stories kind of touch on this other world, right? Do you feel like you plan for your stories to all take
Connect.
place, maybe like in the same world, and also is that also part of the plan to have like a central node that kind of touches on horns and everything else?
Yeah, there's no plan. There's no plan. And I actually think, I don't know if you're a writer yourself, I don't know, I'm sure there are some writers here and stuff. Beware of the tendency to try to plan it all in advance. To build the world, to know all the characters, to have the whole scheme mapped out. Because that's actually an excuse for procrastination. Like you just have to get into it. You just have to start writing pages. You just have to be willing to fuck it up. You know, you're gonna slog through, it's gonna be imperfect, it's never gonna be, the story you had in mind is never, ever gonna be as good as the story you imagine in your head. The only perfect, actually I got a quick story for you, okay? A quick story, this is the whole experience of writing. So I went to a bookstore in Amsterdam once, and for the first time I discovered blind book dates. Do you guys know this?
Yeah.
You go into a bookstore and there's a book wrapped in brown paper tied in twine with a description of what the book is about on the outside. But you don't know the name of the book you're buying, and you don't know the author. And I went into this, and I went into this, and I saw this whole table of books wrapped in brown paper, and one of them was British RAF X-Men fight Gestapo Nazis to decide the fate of World War II. And I was like, that's the best book ever written. I have got to bring that home. I have been wanting to read this book my whole life. But then I brought it home, and I got stuck. I'm like, do I open it? What happened? Because it was Schrodinger's book. As long as I didn't open it, it was the book I'd been waiting my whole life to read. But as soon as I took the packaging off, it was just going to be a book. It was going to have a title, it was going to have an author, the guy was going to make choices, there were going to be scenes that I might like or might not. It would resolve into something specific. My statement is that my creative point here is write the story. It's not going to be as good as it was when it was wrapped in brown paper, when it was the ideal form. It never can be, but you got to get stuck in anyway. You know, accept the fact that you're going to make messy compromises, and you're not going to know what you're doing. You're going to write a scene that you've been waiting to write, and then it's not going to turn out like you thought it would. And anyway, I'm also against outlining, which I think is. You're doing, with an outline, you're doing an autopsy on a story. And the thing about doing an autopsy is you can't do one until something is dead. So I advise against them. Anyway.
Couple more? Yeah, right.
I have a good question. You mentioned a bunch of really amazing authors. How do you feel about Nick Cutter with his otherworldly body horror, sci-fi?
Nick Cutter has to be stopped. No, I actually haven't read Nick. I've had his book, The Troop, on my TBR for like a year and a half, 2 years or something like that, and it's been knocked down a couple times because, especially when you're in publishing and you're in film and stuff, you wind up having to read stuff because you promised you would. Someone will come to you and say, is there any chance you could read this? And if you like it, give it a quote. And so many people have been so good to me over the years and that I always want to try to help too. And so Nick's problem is he never asked me to read something because he was a really nice guy and has never tried to foist his stuff on me. He pays for that by it keeps getting bumped back. But I'm actually hoping to get to Nick Cutter's The True in the fall. I'm a little bit. I was diagnosed with OCD like a little over 10 years ago or something like that, and you never really. That's not like something you get cured of, but you can find really useful ways to sort of divert it. I have my reading all meticulously mapped out on a special shelf with everything broken into 3-month chunks. So I happen to know that I'm reading The Troop in the October, November, December chunk, unless it gets bumped.
Great, and I think maybe one more?
One more?
Yep.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
I just want to say I think that you are masterful at just eliciting the deep-seated fear in your reader. I find your work to be incredible.
Oh, thank you.
You discussed your horror inspirations, but I don't think you get enough credit for how incredible your sardonic wit is and your humor in your books. And I know a lot of times
That's very
horror
kind.
go hand in hand with that. I just want to know, what are some of your comedic inspirations?
Horror and comedy are the same thing. Factually the same thing, because they both speak to the reptile brain. If you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Leatherface takes a sledgehammer to a screaming teenager and brains splat against the camera, okay, you scream. if you're watching Three Stooges and Moe takes a sledgehammer to Larry, you laugh, but you're actually responding to the same scene. So horror and comedy are the you know, they're two sides of the same coin. And you know, as far as humor goes, I think I'm kind of good at writing banter. Actually, the biggest job for me on going from first draft to second draft is cutting out all this banter that I wrote because I was getting to know my own characters. I'm also I'm more secure than I used to be, but I do struggle with insecurity. I struggle with the fear. My great fear is that a reader will be bored and drop the book. It's a desperate race for people's attention. This thing, it's so addictive and people always want to look at it. It's like, how am I going to fight the phone? How am I going to fight Instagram and TikTok? It's terrifying, you know. And the only things I trust are comedy and peril. Comedy and peril. You know, if the character is in moral or spiritual or emotional or physical peril, you'll keep reading. And if you're with people who make you laugh, you'll keep reading because you're enjoying their company. And so those are two things I trust. And whenever a story skates away from those things, I start to sweat a little bit, you know. And so anyway, yeah. You guys have been great. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you everyone for coming today.
I hope I'll see some of you tonight at Abraham's Boys. You can have a good time.
Yes, please come.